I'm Marla Hay. I manage privacy and data governance products at Salesforce. I'm here today to talk to you about the data privacy landscape as just kind of a privacy nerd. Thank you for coming. There's so many great speakers here, and I'm totally humbled to get to be one and that you all chose to come to the session, so thank you so much. Okay, so let's get into it. So first, it's GDPR's first birthday. May 28th marked the very first birthday of our little baby GDPR, and I'll always remember the day that GDPR was born, because it was the month I got about 8 million privacy notification updates from companies I had no idea had my data. I don't know if you guys all had this experience as well. If you're from the EU, it's probably like 16 million, but we all got a whole lot of emails from a whole bunch of companies, which kind of had the opposite effect. It made everybody feel like these companies are doing something nefarious and not respecting my privacy, and it really wasn't very well understood by most consumers, as you can see. There's a tweet for everything. So everybody gets a lot of emails. Some say GDPR, some don't. Maybe not totally clear on what GDPR is. But the bottom line is that consumers were like, what is this? Why am I getting harassed by all of these companies? And that was really the opposite intention of GDPR. GDPR's birth also heralded the era of cookie notifications with no possible way to opt out. This is an actual mobile experience. You can see sort of the text underneath, but you cannot get to the site unless you click that I accept button. There's no X, there's no decline. You're forced to push a big red accept button without any other options in order to just get to the site that you're trying to get to. So, and we know why companies are doing this, right? Because they're reading the letter of the law as we have to force people to accept cookies or we can't show them their site. Otherwise, it's 4% of our revenue. But to consumers, it really just feels like a major lack of choice. And again, it is doing the opposite of what GDPR really intended. The only time I ever want to be forced to accept cookies is at my grandma's house, because her cookies are delicious. You don't need a decline button for these. You're going to eat the cookies because they're good. In all seriousness, though, so GDPR is a really important piece of legislation. It is, and it's great. Like as was mentioned in the keynote, we're really looking at privacy coming to the forefront. This represents that people are saying, "Hey, I don't feel like my privacy is being respected. I don't feel like I have transparency into how my data is being used." And that's really the opportunity that we have here, is to come together and work to the benefit of our consumers, increase that trusted relationship, So we're going to figure out how we go about doing that. But before we do, let's take a look back at GDPR, since it is GDPR's first birthday, and let's look at some of the numbers. So there are 280,000 cases reported to supervisory authorities in the last year. These numbers are all from the European Data Protection Board. So the supervisory authorities are the people that were appointed, they're independent bodies appointed in each of the EU member states to oversee GDPR. And 280,000 represents the total sum of every company that reported a breach, every person who reported a complaint, all reports into any of these authorities across the European Economic Union, or the European Economic Area. Of those 280, 89,000 were breaches. So it's kind of a lot of breaches. This means that a company has reported in to one of the supervisory authorities saying, hey, our data was penetrated in some way, we were hacked, some of our data leaked out, we had some improper access. In addition, 144,000 of those were complaints. So those mean there are 144,000 individuals or parties who went to one of the supervisory authorities, one of those people in a member state governing GDPR, and said, hey, somebody's not doing the right thing with my data. Of those, so these are the things we really want to be focused on here are like, what are those top complaints? What are the things that people are feeling like we're failing at in this first year out on GDPR? And those are the inability to get their data when they're asking for it. So basically, I go to a company and say, hey, I want to get all my personally identifiable information. Can you send that to me? And they don't do it. The other top complaint was inability to stop data processing or unauthorized use of data processing, which is super vague, right? Like basically, I couldn't opt out of stuff. I wanted to opt out of this thing, and they didn't let me, and they were using my data in a way I didn't agree to. So those are like the two areas where we really want to make sure going forward we're doing it right, because those are the things that are really being reported out to the supervisory authorities. In terms of fines, we saw about 90 fines this year, which maybe is not a huge number, but they totaled 56 million euros. So that's, if you break that down, it's around 620 euros or 700,000 in USD per fine, which is like, oh, that's kind of big. That seems like a significant number of fines. Until you kind of dig into the numbers and you realize that it was like all Google. So there's one fine for Google. So CNIL, France's governing body, fined Google 50 million euros for doing personalized advertising without getting consent for it. And so now that leaves only 6 million for everybody else. So now it's like, oh, well, 60,000 euros about, like, that might be less than what it takes to actually be GDPR compliant. Maybe I've been thinking about this all wrong. Maybe this is like not that big of a hit. Thank God I can finally sleep at night. We were holding this thing with baling wire and duct tape. But in the immortal words of Nightmare on Elm Street 3, if you think you're getting out alive, you must be dreaming. And that's because we just haven't seen the fines come through yet. All the regulators, basically those supervisory authorities, the people that are getting all of the reports, are slammed. They are totally underwater, and they have a huge backlog of reports to get through. In addition to that, they are making a point of prioritizing the big guys first. So like the Google thing was not a coincidence. They're going after the most egregious fines, the biggest companies first, which means that we got to start looking at shoring things up. So I don't know if Giles is in here or not, but Giles Watkins, who's around here somewhere, as he put it, we've only got a certain amount of time before we're going to start seeing fines come through. So this isn't like we made it. This is like we bought ourselves some time. Let's go back and make sure we're doing things right. Because pretty soon we're going to start seeing those regulators come through, and they'll get through the Googles, they'll get through the Facebooks, and then they'll get to the backlog of a lot of the rest of us. Okay, but the thing is, it's not just GDPR anymore, right? So we talked about what happened in GDPR the last year, but we're actually we've got new things to worry about. We've got CCPA coming up that's going to go live in January. We've got more privacy regulations beyond that are coming up. Brazil had a big data privacy protection law that comes out around the same time as CCPA does. So now what do? We're going to be in some kind of privacy regulation Groundhog's Day for the rest of our lives, where we wake up, we have a new privacy regulation on the table, we scramble to address it, try to plug all the holes until we eventually just give up and drive our pickup truck off of a cliff with Puxatawny Phil in the front seat with us. There might be a better way. We might have another option. So that's first. Let's talk a little bit about what are the privacy regulations we're really dealing with here, what's coming up, and what are some things that we can do to cross-cut those to get ourselves ready, to get ourselves in a better position to be ready for the next one, for the new privacy landscape, for the new normal of privacy regulation Groundhog Day. Okay, so we're talking about GDPR. The next one to come out is CCPA. This has been called the GDPR Lite. It's been called California GDPR. It's basically just GDPR with some avocados on it. No, that's not true. All right, let's actually look at how they really compare. So there are some. So this is not a legal document, obviously, but far too few words. But there are some very significant similarities and some differences, but primarily similarities, especially in consumer data rights, which is really where we're seeing the fines, and which is really where we're seeing the complaints. So when we look at GDPR and CCPA, they both have rights to understand personal data being held. CCPA it's slightly different. It's last 12 months, but in general, you have a right to go and ask a company, I want to understand my personal data. They both have requirements around being able to download, delete data, et cetera. Processing it can be a little bit different. GDPR you might think of as more of an opt-in. CCPA you might think of as more of an opt-out in some contexts. CCPA is more oriented around sold data, and GDPR is more comprehensive. But when it comes to things like data rectification, transparency, privacy notifications, et cetera, they're really very similar. People will have the same data rights across both with really kind of minor tweaks. Even like CCPA, which is oriented around more sale of data, where it's trying to ensure that consumers can opt out of data sale or data sharing, GDPR doesn't explicitly cover that, but it's in there, right? It's part of that comprehensive, part of the kind of comprehensive documentation of GDPR. So these two things are really not so far apart. There's some underlying structure here that we can take advantage of. Okay, so let's throw in another one. Let's throw in the Brazil privacy law just to have a third to compare it to. The Brazilian data privacy law is even more like GDPR. It's basically like in all of these categories, you'll see it's identical to the way that GDPR is set up. There are some minor differences. There are things like the Brazilian data privacy law is a little more vague in some areas. It also doesn't allow things like pseudonymization. So like GDPR and CCPA both kind of like will let you get by with a little more if you pseudonymize the data versus fully anonymizing it. And the Brazilian privacy law is basically like anonymize or nothing. Anonymize or bust. You got to anonymize your data, otherwise we don't give you any special protections for pseudonymization. But the underlying data, so other than those minor differences, the data right structure is exactly the same. All right, so this is three things that we compared, but that's not all that we have here, right? We've actually got a massive number of additional laws that are coming to fruition. And this is just a sampling. This is not comprehensive. We had Nigeria came out with basically a GDPR for Nigeria just this year, just in January. Vietnam just this year launched its first ever data protection law, and they're actually starting to investigate Facebook right now. And it's been predicted by a privacy lawyer that Illinois and New Jersey are going to be the next ones to kind of come out with their own data privacy law. Washington kind of had one on the table that kind of died. We'll see if that comes back. But you can see this is just going to keep increasing. And this is just since GDPR. This is just things where GDPR was the first thing to go. We're not even talking about like can spam or any of the things that existed prior to GDPR. So this is just like what's new. So how do we want to address this? Well, the way that we can look at this is to take kind of the underlying structure of these laws, like for example, the Nigerian law, just like Brazil, has the exact same data rights protection as GDPR does. So what we can do is talk about the underlying functionality we can put together to make it so that we just have a tiny gap when each of these new laws comes out. Doesn't mean you can fire your in-house attorney. Those guys can be really important. But it puts us in a really good position. So we're going to talk about three things. First, finding your customer data. This is like the number one issue that we've got, right, is customers aren't able to get the PII that they're requesting. So this is going to be thing one we talk through. Thing two, make it easy-ish to manage. This is not like necessarily going to be a slam dunk, but we'll talk through what the things are there that we need to do. And then finally, give control to your customers. So this is where we get back to let's make this a positive customer experience. Let's use this as an opportunity to make it so we're doing something that our customers love and engender trust, as opposed to making them feel like they're spammed or they're losing even more transparency. Okay, so the first thing, find your customer data. What does that mean? That means you are looking at where your data is housed, where is it flowing, who has access to it, and what is the risk level. So these are three things to think through when we're looking at how do we actually ensure we're finding our customer data. So one is cataloging it. And none of this is like super necessarily easy. It's easy to write it down. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy to actually accomplish, but it's really important. It's critical to every other step. So you need to understand where your data is and where it's stored. You also need to know why you have it and how it's used. So this is just a huge cataloging exercise. Next is understanding data access. So who can access this data? Do you have third parties accessing it? Are you selling it to anybody? Who internally at your organization has access to it? And then finally, what's the sensitivity of this data? Is this public data? Is this data that anybody could have if they walked up the street? Or is this really critical data to somebody's identity, like their social security number, their credit card information? Okay, so now once we catalog it, and we understand it and we know the riskiness of it, we can move on to the next step, which is make it easy-ish to manage. So this is like we've got our ragtag data army, and we're going to kind of put them into formation and make it so we can actually do something with that information. So in order to make it easy to manage, there's a few things we can think through. First is data minimization. So this is in step one, we kind of talk through how do we, what is your data being used for? Where is it? And so minimized data is really about taking that taking that catalog and looking through and understanding what don't you really need. And so if you've got data sitting out there that you're not using for any purpose right now, it will significantly reduce your risk to just get rid of it if you can, which is like kind of anathema to the concept of always getting more personal data in. But truly, if you're not using it, it's going to go stale anyway. Just cut it out if you can. The other thing is, if you don't need to tie data back to an individual, anonymize the information. So this will save you some headache in kind of across the board on most of those regulations, GDPR, CCPA, the Brazilian Data Privacy Protection Law, et cetera. If you can anonymize it, it'll save you just another risk surface. Then finally, data retention. So how long do you need to keep your data? What are the processes for disposal of that data? So decide if you need something for a period of time for legal reasons or for internal reasons, what those reasons are, and then get rid of the data that you don't have. So this kind of ties back to data minimization as well. Next is the data subject processes. So now that you know where your data is in theory, so like Bob in accounting has some piece of personally identifiable information on people, and Sue in customer success has some, and Sally in finance has some. We need to be able to get it together. And so this could be as rudimentary as I have a spreadsheet that lists like Bob in accounting has this information, and then I've got to deal with Bob where if somebody says, hey, I need my information, we go pull it together. It could be like that simple. It could be as sophisticated as you put like APIs in place to each of the data systems to be able to pull that data in real time, or you pull it into an MDM or something more sophisticated. It doesn't have to be though. It could be literally like these are the people we talk to when we get a data subject request to make sure that we're covering all of the data that we have in the system. And then finally, review and enhance your security. So this is like, make sure people who don't need access to your data don't have it. Make sure third parties, you know why they have it, and if they no longer need it, you're getting rid of it. That's going to be a big one, especially as we see CCPA coming through. Okay, and then the last piece of this is give control to your customers. So what does this mean? This means three things: transparency, data rights, and consent and preferences. So this is really showing your customers what you're doing with the data to the extent that you can. If you're sharing it or selling it, making it clear. So if they're authenticating onto a website, onto your app, onto your site, they can easily see like this is what we're doing with each piece of your data. We're taking your email address and we're sharing it with our partner, or we're taking your email address, we're only using it to do order fulfillment, whatever that is. The more transparency you can give them, the greater that trusted relationship will be. And then also give them the ability to revoke that if you can, if it makes sense to be able to do that, or if it's within kind of the bounds of the law. So if you're selling data to someone, you'll need to be able to give them the right to revoke it. Then data access rights. So give your customers an option, a place to say, please give me my data. So they can go in and say, I want to port my data, I want to download it. And then that goes to your customer success center, or it goes to an automated process that kicks it down. The more you can automate this stuff, the better, obviously, but it's not, you don't have to start there. It can just be baby steps. Just give them an email address to start with where they can ask for these kind of data rights. And then have that process on the other side that might be as simple as like, now I go talk to Bob in accounting to get the PII that he's got. And then finally, consent and preferences. So give your customers the ability to opt in and out of data usage to the extent that you can. There's also something I want to mention here, which is that consent is just one legal basis. So one of the issues that we saw with the email blast is people thought, well, if I don't get agreement from the end user now, I will never be able to contact them again in the future. I will totally lose my relationship with them. And I have until May 28th, 2018 to do it. So I'm going to shoot all these emails out before I'm going to get in trouble for spamming everybody. And in reality, that may not have had to happen. If a customer has a legitimate interest in your organization, if there are other reasons that you have that person's information and you're processing it, you don't necessarily have to have consent as well in order to use it. So make sure you're looking at those additional legal bases so that you're not putting the onus on the end user to agree to everything, especially when they're not understanding why they're being asked this question. If it's out of the blue, we're sending you an email because a regulation came out. That may not be something that's going to be very clear to consumers. So look at what you actually have to ask for in that time period. And then as much as you can, use things like just-in-time consent. So if you have a commerce site and your customer is buying some hiking boots and you share data potentially with a hiking website or something so that they know this person is interested in hiking. Make that part of the process as they're checking out, not something that shows up on the screen when they first arrive and they have to check through all these buttons just to even get to the website. Make it something that makes sense to them and occurs at the moment of purchase or at the moment when they're actually doing something that makes sense for you to ask the question. And also make it clear why you're going to be sharing that information or providing things, because they're much more likely to opt in that way. If you're saying, hey, would you want to be part of this? Would you want us to share your data with this hiking website because then you'll get hiking updates? They might want that. And it might be relevant to them because they're already looking at hiking trails and buying hiking boots. So that's consent and preferences. So the overarching kind of story here is get your data, make that data easy-ish to manage, as rudimentary as you need it to be at first, and then give control to your customers. Understand what things you need to ask them about, understand when you need to get permission from them, and then do it in a way that is at the moment, just in time, that makes sense to them. So it feels like you're growing your relationship with them, not that they're having an onslaught of questions come to them or being forced to read and update and agree to privacy policies, which are just hindering their ability to get to your site, your app, your store. And if we do those things, we will be able to keep the regulators happy. We're touching on things that will make it easier to do PII requests, make it easier to manage processing. We will keep our customers happy because we're going to give that control back to them. We're going to let them see on our when they visit our digital properties what information we have about them, what we're doing with it, and give them the ability to opt in and out. And then we'll throw some sprouts and avocados in there and keep Californians happy too. And all of this together will hopefully prevent us from setting off the doomsday device. Thank you very much. I think we've got a few minutes for questions. Appreciate your time.